Suez Canal, storm center of controversy for weeks, now becomes a cause of war in a lightning sequence of diplomatic and military moves. Since its seizure and nationalization by President Nasser of Egypt, the vital waterway has precipitated a new crisis in the already tense Middle East. Crack French units are embarked at Marseille, bound for a joint staging area with Great Britain on Cyprus.
In 1956, the Soviet Union wasn't the only country fighting to hold on to its satellites. While Russian tanks were crushing the Hungarian uprising, Britain and France invaded Egypt in a display of colonial arrogance and brutal desperation. Their attack was aimed at regaining control of the Suez Canal, the strategic link between the oil-rich Middle East and Western Europe, which had been controlled by an Anglo-French alliance for nearly a century. The incursion ended in humiliation for the invaders. It was a sign of the times for the once great colonial empires. During the decades following World War II, dozens of colonies defied colonial rule by declaring their independence. Each had to choose a method of government, and most faced severe economic challenges. Many new nations were forced to choose sides in the Cold War, leading to internal divisions, authoritarian governments, and anarchy. But a coalition of poor African and Asian states sought to avoid this fate. They banded together to gain more influence in global affairs. When leaders of the non-aligned movement met in Bandung, Indonesia in 1955, they represented 2/3 of the world's population.
It is a new departure in the history of the world that leaders of Asian and African peoples can meet together in their own countries to discuss and deliberate upon matters of common concern.
Egypt's president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, represented the rising tide of Arab nationalism in the Middle East. He described his form of government as moderate socialism, explaining it as socialism without capitalists, without imperialists, and without communists. But Nasser and other shrewd leaders played the two superpowers against each other to gain military and economic aid. American leaders suspected that many non-allied nations were under communist influence and tried to change their governments. In 1953, the Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, became the target of the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency's first regime change action. The CIA engineered a coup to get rid of Mossadegh, and then vested power in the Shah of Iran. The Shah became a staunch ally of the West. By the time U.S. President Richard Nixon visited Iran in 1972, most Iranians resented the Shah's repressive government and America's growing influence in the Middle East. But the success of the Iranian coup had been intoxicating and gave rise to many similar operations designed to eliminate potential threats and shape the politics of the Third World. They did not all meet with success, but none failed as catastrophically as American attempts at nation-building in Vietnam. Vietnam and its neighbors in Southeast Asia were colonized by the French in the 19th century. French Indochina, as it was known, was the crown jewel in France's vast empire until the beginning of World War II, when Japan invaded the region and seized control of Vietnam. When the war ended in 1945, France sought to reclaim its colony. They were opposed by a communist organization called the Viet Minh. Their leader was a Vietnamese nationalist named Ho Chi Minh. Ho dreamed of uniting his country under one independent government. France fought the Vietnam for 8 years in the First Indochina War before suffering a devastating defeat in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. French forces withdrew from Vietnam, while Ho's popularity spread throughout the country. But Vietnam became a pawn in the emerging Cold War. During ceasefire negotiations, the country was divided. Ho and his communist government would rule North Vietnam. A new Western-backed government was created in the South. American leaders feared that all of Vietnam would turn communist. They pushed aside the French and supported South Vietnamese Prime Minister Ngo Dinh Diem. Vietnam itself was not strategically important to the U.S., but American leaders feared that if Vietnam fell to communism, other countries in the region would follow. This became known as the domino principle.
Finally, you have broader considerations that might follow what you would call the falling domino principle. You have a row of dominoes set up and you knock over the first one, and what will happen to the last one is certainly that it'll go over very quickly. So you could have a beginning of a disintegration that would have the most profound influence.
The tragedy that followed was epic in its scope and senselessness. Billions of dollars and more than 50,000 American lives were spent to stop the dominoes from falling. In the process, the United States laid waste to much of the country and killed more than 3 million people. But the justification for war in Vietnam was fatally flawed. Ho was a communist, but he was not a puppet of Moscow, as the U.S. feared. His resistance was based on a fierce patriotism that inspired his people to fight on, even in the face of almost inconceivable losses. With the benefit of military support from the Soviet Union and Communist China, they frustrated the U.S. for 2 decades. Finally, in 1975, a tired and demoralized United States abandoned the war. The last Americans were evacuated from South Vietnam, and communist forces overran the capital city of Saigon.
But these events, tragic as they are, portend neither the end of the world nor of America's leadership in the world.
In the end, the dominoes didn't fall. But the communist victory did influence the Cold War. In the 1970s, the United States endured a crisis of self-confidence that came to be known as the Vietnam Syndrome. Americans lost faith in their government. Political leaders lost faith in their military. The country questioned its role in foreign affairs. No one had any taste for another Vietnam. This view contributed to an easing of international relations during the decade known as détente. In the Soviet Union, the effects of the Vietnam War were even more far-reaching. Emboldened by the communist victory and America's ambivalence toward foreign affairs, Kremlin leaders spent lavishly to build their arsenals and extend their communist empire around the world. It was, in effect, a brazen attempt to overtake the United States and win the Cold War. It would be, however, their greatest mistake.